If you have any level of K-12 education, you've probably been to a museum on a field trip. Now, if you live in a large city, you're fortunate to go to a really nice museum, like the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, where you can see T-Rex skeletons. Your offerings were slimmer if you grew up in a more rural environment like me. In central Iowa, maybe we could see an Underground Railroad house or Living History Farms, which is sort of a more modest version of colonial Williamsburg. But a museum is much more than just a collection of artifacts. In some ways, it's how a society understands itself or wants to understand itself because it chooses what stories are told or foregrounded, and it determines how the past is exhibited, framed, and talked about. I mean, this isn't me just speculating. Sometimes this is written directly into the mission statement of a museum. For example, the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum was founded right after the conclusion of World War II, when the United States was the world's aviation superpower and held air superiority on huge swaths of the globe. On another episode of this podcast, I spoke with the president of Kansas City's Negro League Baseball Museum, and he said that the mission of it was to show how America's black athletes were able to survive and sometimes even thrive during incredibly difficult moments in the Jim Crow era. To explore this psychoanalysis of the United States, I'm speaking with Samuel Redman. He's the author of the book The Museum, A Short History of Crisis and Resilience. We explore how museums grow and spread in the latter half of the 19th century in the United States, when, after the Civil War, American national identity forms and takes shape. We look at museums during the 1918 influenza pandemic, the Great Depression, World War II, the 1970 art strike in New York City, and recent controversies in American museums, the 1980s culture war, during the COVID-19 pandemic, and new questions about race and gender issues. So by diving deeper into these changes that emerged from these challenges, Redman argues that cultural institutions can and should use their history to prepare for challenges going forward. Hope you enjoy this discussion with Samuel Redman. Your book opens with a fire that engulfs the Smithsonian in 1865. The New York Times writes an article, and it says that the destruction of so many of its fine collections will be viewed as a national calamity. So I'm curious, as historians, we know that there are many things that once existed that no longer exist and are permanently lost. This includes the Mayan codices that were burned by Spanish conquistadors, or there are many plays from the Greek dramatist Aeschylus that we know existed, but they don't exist in any form, not even in quotation. Are there any particular objects or museum items that have been lost that you think are particularly tragic?
That's such a great and unique question. I really appreciate that. And there's some, I think two sort of answers that come to mind. One is in the wake of that 1865 fire that I described in the opening of the book. A number of objects were lost that, as I say in the book, were maybe not as valuable to science and history as they were presumed to be. So, for instance, some rare scientific instruments that, and also duplicates of things that were available. But also paintings, original paintings that were of places in the world or people that documented some of those things before the advent of photography and film to document it in another sort of way. Before that, painting was commonly used in geology and in anthropology, if you will, as a method for documenting people from around the world. Flashing forward to the more recent history, a tragic episode or a couple of episodes, there again been museum fires have been in the news recently, including the awful destruction of the National Museum of Brazil, and then also the Museum of Chinese in America in New York City. There was a tragic fire that ultimately I don't think was quite as bad as originally feared, but that destroyed some original materials related to the Chinese immigrant experience in the United States. So a big story in my book is how do we respond to those moments and how do we work to prevent them?
Right. I mean, the past is very fragile, and I think that's something that a lot of people don't realize. You know this very well. One other thing I want to explore before we look at the particulars of museum evolution in the United States, and that is, what is a museum? Because you make the point that museums aren't just buildings that house old items and catalog them and display them for the public, but in some ways it's a way to psychoanalyze a culture of how it decides to remember itself and what it presents about its past, what it upplays, what it downplays, etc. In a way, what is the origin of a modern museum? I mean, we've had, depending on how you define museum, you could go back to the ancient world. Bronze Age civilizations had royal archives. churches had reliquaries where you have the bones and sacred items of saints and others, but those are different from a modern museum. So how would you define what a modern museum is and what are its origins?
Right. These are the types of questions historians love, and they love to debate and think about what are the real origins of this thing that we, in many respects, sort of take for granted now, right? That a museum is frequently a place where we can see objects or art or historical things from our region or around the world in some cases. And the origins of that as a practice probably can be dated to a couple of different strands or threads. One, you mentioned sort of the creation in ancient times of archives and things like the Library of Alexandria, which probably was more than just a repository for texts like we sort of understand a library now. And then somewhat later, of course, there's a phenomenon like cabinets of curiosity in several centuries ago in places like Germany, where nobility would fairly commonly collect objects again from around the world in sort of a natural history specimen type of mode. And you would display those objects in a beautiful cabinet for your many visitors to your home. So there's been a practice on a number of different levels to collect and try to organize materials from the natural world and from history and to display those things. So over time, especially over the course of the 19th century, museums in Europe and then in the United States begin to really emerge. And this is co-joined to a bunch of other really important stories, right? Like the story of nationalism. So there are major national museums like the Smithsonian, but it's also a story of urban boosterism, right? Like again and again, if you go back and read newspapers from the 19th century, people in Chicago are saying, geez, we really need a great museum because we want to really stick it to New York City, right? And show them that we're a city that can sort of hang on the national stage. And a great university was sort of seen as a mark of that. But a museum, was seen as, in many respects, even more important. So a number of different threads really came together to give us modern museums the way we understand and think about them today.
I was curious about that because you note that there's a huge proliferation of museums in the latter half of the 19th century in the United States. Are museums at this time period sort of their time's version of, what would cities do as sort of a boondoggle to boost its profile? Maybe have a professional sports stadium. We need a soccer team, or we're going to give a tax credit so we have a tech hub. We're going to be the Silicon Valley of Ohio. So Cleveland announces it's the new tech hub, or Mobile, Alabama, or whatever cities would do to raise their status from second tier to first tier. Is this what's going on with museums in this time period in the latter half of the 19th century?
No doubt about it. Yes. And it's what we often forget in the story is that not all of these experiments work out, right? Like in Philadelphia, for instance, there's a relatively short-lived commercial museum, which is pitched by city leaders at the time and museum organizers as being a way to really put Philadelphia commerce on the map. And it'll be about translating foreign business documents and showcasing commercial achievements. Well, that didn't prove all that interesting to visitors ultimately, and it wasn't terribly effectively presented. And so that museum disappears. But one of the things that I argue in this book is that despite their many failings and despite instances where they have folded or faced challenges, museums from the 19th century, many of them have proven to be quite durable in terms of facing many different kinds of challenges, especially throughout the course of the 20th century, ranging from pandemic to war and economic uncertainty. So it's pretty remarkable once these things become established that they're pretty firmly ingrained in these various communities.
A point that you note after the fire in the Smithsonian in 1865 is that it rebuilds, and you remark that perhaps a museum had been weighed down by many ghosts of its past, where it's able to add new exhibits, trains bring in new collections. Later on, electric lights illuminate the exhibit halls, new curators come on staff. How does the Smithsonian change over these decades? And I suppose what I'm going at with that question is kind of like national historiography of how America reinterprets its own past. It's coming out of the Civil War period. It's the Reconstruction era. Maybe some people are trying to push a narrative of reunification. Turner's frontier thesis is becoming popular in the 1890s, where explorations of what makes the American character unique from its European counterparts are being explored in new ways. So what's going on with the Smithsonian, maybe in particular, and museums in general, as the 19th century goes on, and how America tries to understand its own past in a different way?
Such an important question, and one that, too, I write about a fair amount in my other books. My first book, Bone Rooms, on the history of collecting and exhibiting human remains, and especially in my second book, Prophets and Ghosts, the story of salvage anthropology, because I think that salvage anthropology plays a key role in that story, the questions that you're asking about, too. That is to say, that, like you're suggesting, in many respects, a fundamental rethink of what history and what museums are, but also an object-based rethinking of those stories. So that is to say that as disciplines like anthropology and history and linguistics, but also sciences like geology and astronomy get going, the places like the Smithsonian and museums, the American Museum of Natural History and Paleontology, really become key leaders in those fields in the late 19th century in a way that universities are still pretty sleepy, and they're still focusing on rote learning. But to have, objects that people can latch onto becomes a really compelling driver, and something that, it feeds into sort of the national collection and a lot of other sort of forces. But it's sort of this important turning point, right? Because you're having the professionalization of a lot of these disciplines. And meanwhile, you have the growing up of these institutions. So the co-joining of those factors really means that you have a lot of money coming into museums, and then new technology and improved methods in terms of how you're displaying things. It leads to a lot more visitors, frankly, and a larger place in the national consciousness. More and more people are thinking about the Smithsonian and other major museums by the end of the 19th century.
Can you give a few examples of different museums that serve different people? Because there's not a one size fits all with museums. And just to take some modern examples off the top of my head, you have the Smithsonian. It's funded by the federal government, and it has a particular mission to preserve the United States past. But then others could have a more ideological bent. So in Istanbul, Turkey, where I lived for a number of years, there's a wonderful museum. I forget the exact name, something like the Museum of Islamic Sciences. So we'll have people like Avicenna and Averroes in there. But it's funded by the government, perhaps as a way to show Islamic civilization's contribution to world civilization. So there's a ideological bent, but I think it's still very well put together. Another example is the Museum of Creation Science, if I have the name right. It's run by a creationist named Ken Ham, who has had debates with Bill Nye. He interprets the book of Genesis in a very literal way. There's a replica scale of Noah's Ark. The point is to prove the validity of the claims of the book of Genesis if you read it in the most literal way possible. So the aims of that museum and the Smithsonian are different. But what are some different missions of museums that you could give examples of, in the past and more contemporary examples, and who are they ultimately designed to serve?
Right. Absolutely. So this is, again, a really important question. And, another example that I'll tie in that is a type of museum that's really evolved in the United States. But back in the 19th century, medical museums were really prominent because, well, for a number of reasons, people just in general were curious about seeing them. But by and large, medical museums were not pitched at the general public. Medical museums were for medical students and scientists to study how various injuries might present themselves. For instance, a bullet wound into a human femur. Like, what does that look like? And, the other example that I use to explain this is that, let's say you're a medical student studying frostbite. How are you going to learn what frostbite looks like in the middle of winter? Now, we take for granted that you can have a color image printed in a textbook. In the 19th century, that would have been a very expensive proposition. And then you couldn't maybe have hundreds of illustrations. That would have been prohibitively expensive. So and then two, you're comparing a 3D object, one that you can hold in your hands at a medical museum, to a flat 2D image. So nowadays, right, like you can look on a computer screen, you can see many different examples, you could rotate those images. Medical doctors have developed the practice of rounds in order to go and see many different types of conditions. But in the 19th century, medical museums were considered a way of doing that. So there have been the rise and fall of different types of museums. And then within those institutions, like your question suggests, sometimes there are different ideological bents. And there are museums that undergo sort of a rigorous process of accreditation and abide by certain rules and best practices, and others that are falling outside of the scope of that type of an accreditation system. But that said, right, we're not naive observers. We know that all of these museums have an agenda of some kind and a mission. And sometimes those are fueling more ideological purposes. And other times there is more of in my view, a genuine truth-seeking type of engagement. But, either way, I think it's, especially today in contemporary times, but I think throughout recent history, especially, people are curious, like, what is the perspective of the museum? What is your position on something like evolution? I just brought my son to the Science Museum of Minnesota, and I used to work there, but a recent addition that they have to the Dinosaurs and Fossil Hall is a very large text statement on the museum's position on evolution, right? That evolution is a scientific reality. When we say theory, we don't mean that it's a guess, but rather that's something that has been demonstrated over time. And that's printed in giant text on the wall. So yeah, I think that museums are well served by taking those questions head on directly. Obviously, I have a different viewpoint on the Creation Museum than museums like the American Museum of Natural History, which, in my view, present a more realistic science-based point of view. But those institutions too, we need to think about the funding that they receive from big donors and their positions as well, and understand that those are not neutral institutions by any stretch of the imagination.
Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. But first, I want to give a shout out to all the other great shows on the Parthenon Podcast Network, including Beyond the Big Screen. And you can find this and many other great shows at parthenonpodcast.com. Well, I suppose I should get to this question of what makes a museum, I suppose, good and bad. And this can be defined in many ways. Two examples I thought of there are two museums that try to interpret a single historical event in very different ways. So I mentioned that I lived in Turkey for a number of years, and an event that is heavily contested, well, I say contested, it's sort of Turkey versus the world, is the 1915 Armenian genocide. Mm-hmm. And in Yerevan, Armenia, there's the Armenian Genocide Museum that describes this event, the ethnic cleansing of approximately 1.5 million Armenians in the final years of the Ottoman Empire. But if you go to the Turkish city of Iğdır, you can visit the Memorial and Museum of Martyred Turks Massacred by Armenians, which claims that Armenians killed 80,000 Turks here. So were there Turkish people killed by Armenians, particularly those who were involved in different revolutionary groups? Yes, that did happen. Do the two killings balance each other out? Absolutely not. And I say that as an Ottomanist. So that's an example of, they both have agendas and missions they're trying to stay. I'd say one is based on documentation and facts. The other one is very clearly not so, and trying to push an incredibly revisionist account of what happened. So how would you define when a museum is good versus when it isn't?
Another important question. And another sort of wrinkle to this is that I would argue that there are some communities that are in need of hearing hard truths directly. But then there are other communities at times and places that, are looking for and need, in many respects, more celebratory narratives. That there's been a large, I think, really important conversation about, especially when thinking about racial justice issues, to what extent can and we should, of course, focus on the systemic problems that society faces, but it can't all be about that, right? Like you can't, you also have to, when thinking about, for instance, narratives of race and racism related to Black history in the United States, you also need to find moments of Black joy and artistic expression to present in the story as well. So What I found interesting in thinking about the broader history of museums in crisis is that, like many things, right, as a historian, this is perhaps a predictable answer, but to say this isn't a new thing, that in different ways, at different moments in US history, museums have wrestled with these questions. So, for example, the Second World War, there's some really interesting internal dialogues at museums that where ultimately they decide, we're going to create basically two separate gallery experiences for people. That this gallery is a meditation on the war and everything that's going on with it and how it relates to natural history questions. But this gallery has nothing to do with war at all. This gallery is on native plants of North America, and we're not going to tie it in any meaningful way to the war. Now, there are other, even that example alone, during World War I, there was an exhibit on native plants in North America that the museum leaders completely reoriented the exhibit that was more scholarly, I guess, in orientation, or academic, I guess you could say, to something like, here's the pragmatic wartime use of native plants in North America. So really, I think museums have sort of seen both directions and experimented with thinking about what an audience needs. And sometimes, especially before visitor surveys, a lot of that was based on assumptions that museum leaders had, sometimes pretty inaccurate assumptions. But then gradually, while those assumptions are still in place in many respects, there have been more in-depth studies with visitors and communities and what they need. So a good museum, a successful museum, I would argue, has a mission statement that they're true to, but also is ever changing, is flexible and thinking about the needs of the community and how those may evolve over time. And I think that we sometimes mythologize that museums are this sort of playthings for elites, when in fact they do have a lot of potential to serve broader communities. And in many respects, they do serve broader communities through educational programming and other types of outcomes. But I think it's always a good emphasis to try to broaden that and to think, more broadly about the community that they serve. But that's been a question that museums have wrestled with for quite some time and had different answers to along the way, which I found fascinating.
Right. It's at first pass, if people think of museums, they imagine field trips that they were forced to go on when they were in third and fourth grade and learning about their city's founder who lived from 1845 to 1890 and being bored out of their minds by a tour guide talking to them by a well-meaning but maybe dry volunteer. When, if you think about it another way, a museum is sort of like you get to look at the psychiatrist's notepad of the psychological evaluation of your state or your city or your nation and what it's thinking and what it's feeling. So looking at it from another way, I mean, hey, do you want to Freudian psychoanalyze your place where you live? Well, you can do that at the museum. I'd like to jump to the event, which in some ways was the impetus for you writing the book, and that was the Spanish flu, which you were thinking about this during the COVID lockdown and how museums were trying to cope with this and be resilient. And museums have to evolve and change due to national difficulties and struggles that it has gone through. And that was true in the case of the Spanish flu. So could you tell me about that event and maybe how it relates to 2020 and 2021?
Sure. So another key argument of the book ended up being that these events are rarely singular or isolated, much like the pandemic is happening today, that's coinciding with a really important moment of racial reckoning, that's coinciding with labor unrest, a lot of things happening all at once. And in 1918 to 1920, similarly, there was a pandemic. Returning soldiers were coming home from the First World War and taking jobs from other people who had been working, and there were a huge number of strikes, and there was also racial unrest, white supremacist violence directed especially at Black Americans. So what became interesting to me is that the Spanish flu, or the 1918 influenza epidemic, it's noted in museum records, but it is not as prominent as one would think. But I also, having now lived through this most recent pandemic, I can see a lot of people so eager to move on and sort of forget some of the realities that we've been facing recently. Honestly, one of the key take-home points from this era between 1918 and 1920 is just how much was going on in that moment in time. And the 1918 flu impacted curators. I mean, curators became sick and perished. Visitor numbers declined quite clearly. The number of tour requests declined in some major cities. So it clearly made an impact, but it, in so many respects, was overshadowed by the First World War. The sort of traumatic and remarkable experience of seeing people pulled away and joining the Canadian Armed Forces or joining the US Armed Services a little later on. And so all of that really had an impact on museums. But I was surprised to discover that only a couple of short articles had really been written connecting museums and the 1918-1919 flu epidemic. So that was an interesting starting point.
In the Great Depression, everyone has fewer funds to work with, including museums, and they have to zero in on what is considered essential, or as we say today, critical infrastructure. It can do wonders to really focus the mind. So what happens during the Depression, and what sort of items at museums do you see as being considered essential?
Right. So again, there are key things that happen here that are clearly bad outcomes. And I don't want to downplay that fact. So for instance, in the Great Depression, as was true with other economic downturns, people lost their job. And that was a negative outcome of something like the Great Depression. But like you say, it causes people to, sort of rethink or think through the significant operations of the museum and what their most critical assets are and how to sort of readjust. And during the Great Depression, the New Deal initiatives in particular, so things like the Works Progress Administration and the National Youth Administration, gave federal dollars and job opportunities for people that were, many of them, linked up to museums. So this was not just the Smithsonian, which had a huge WPA, like almost an army of people working at the institution, but at museums throughout the country. And they are, sort of looking inward because museums can't do as many major expeditions and take on collecting quite as much during that era. But here they have this vast backlog of national treasures that need to be maintained. Out of work carpenters, right? I mean, people who had been working in carpentry as a career, that all of those job opportunities dry up. And now museums are asking to build new exhibits. And it's sort of this marriage made in heaven, if you will. And something that I advocate is a specific moment in national museum history that we should look back at with a little more intensity, because when there's an economic downturn, there could very productively be, a sort of a Green New Deal project, right? For installing solar panels on museums, but also refurbishing exhibits and hiring public historians and recent museum studies graduates to work on various sort of internal aspects of museum collections care. So sort of from top to bottom, museums received an influx of labor, and it ended up, like you say, sort of clarifying what are our major strengths and how can we sort of turn to collecting and caring for and curating those materials and conserving them long term.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. There were a lot that came out of this. I spent a good chunk of time several months ago getting lost in the Federal Writers Project, which in the 1930s were funds from the New Deal for out-of-work writers to do a number of things. One was to interview and document and record conversations with former slaves. So it's an incredibly rich archive. If you're going to get lost in something and waste several hours, I would argue it's a much better use of time than doom scrolling through Instagram. So that's my recommendation. I'd like to jump ahead to the culture wars of the 80s, which from our vantage point seems really quaint and charming, where people feared that their child was only one Dungeons and Dragons game away from full-blown Satanism. If you just roll that 12-sided die once, the Demogorgon will come and suck your child into Lucifer worship. But there were a lot of things that were happening in the art community. There was the 1970 art strike, which I knew nothing about before your book. And probably the most infamous touchstone of the culture wars of the 80s, I would say, the photograph by Andre Serrano called The Piss Christ. So can you take us through what's happening during the 70s, 80s culture wars in museums?
Right. So there is a really reemergent debate and series of debates, you might say, about museums and art. The culture wars, of course, were also about what we see on television and music and how music is distributed and sold and a whole host of other issues. But it's also the case, right, that museums, again, become this pretty important flashpoint. And the 1970 art strike is an episode where artists in New York City stage a protest and a walkout at museums in the city. And they're calling for an end to the war, an end to sexism, racism, and oppression. So they have these really broad goals. And of course, they're not successful in really achieving those goals, but it really prefigures a lot of the debates that come later about museums, again, by the 80s and 90s, when these larger culture war issues are really fomenting. Then suddenly museums again become a hot button epicenter, I guess, to mix metaphors, for these conversations. And then a key example of that is the famous Enola Gay episode, where the B-29 Superfortress airplane, the first to drop an atomic weapon in warfare on Japan, is scheduled to be displayed at the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum. And the curators want to present this from, sort of an updated historiographical perspective that accounts for both sides and, doesn't just sort of show this triumphal vision of American might and justice during World War II, but instead shows the damage wrought by this new weapon and meditates on that from a critical perspective. So a leaked version of the exhibit plans made the rounds to a number of different organizations, including veterans groups, which at the time really pushed back against this. And ultimately, it resulted in a really stripped down exhibit that does little more than sort of display the dimensions of this really important airplane. And what's interesting to me is that it sort of showed or resulted, I think, in a chilling effect in a lot of the conversation. And it was deemed a crisis at the time. But then very soon thereafter, it sort of demonstrated another story like that. You needed to be ready for those types of controversies and be prepared for these broader conversations. And how do we lean into those critical conversations in addition to sort of knowing what minefields to avoid, if you will? So I think the Smithsonian in particular, but museums in general, now take a very different approach as a result of those conversations in the 80s and 90s.
Before we ask about sort of like the future museums, as an aside, I'm curious, what is your absolute favorite museum and why it's your favorite? And if you need a second or two to think about that, I could mention experiences I've had for both good or for ill.
Right,
in Kansas City, there's the World War I Museum, which is absolutely fantastic. I can't recommend it highly enough. It's incredibly well put together. It gives you a scope and a sense of what the war was, even if you know nothing about it. I also interviewed the president of the Negro League Baseball Museum on this show, which listeners can check out in the archives if they want to. A lot of museums aren't bad, but sometimes you'll just get staff that it's not like you're getting a tenured professor there. Sometimes you'll just get any volunteer. And medieval blogger I follow named Tim O'Neill mentions that he had gone to medieval museums where you would see armor that's clearly meant for a child that's 11 or 12. It's for a prince, or maybe they're in Regency. And tour guides would say, oh, that armor's for an adult. People were just a lot shorter back then and just have no idea. So they're doing their best, but they're just simply not trained in these things. So not to be a too cool for school debunker and someone who sits in the back and says, well, actually, it's like this. But, sometimes your experiences will be hit or miss. So are there any particular museums that really stand out to you as your favorite?
Sure. And, because you've invited this from a personal perspective, I'll answer from a highly personal perspective that to me, I really appreciate both the larger museum experience. So I love going to a place like the Smithsonian, of course, but also smaller institutions and hidden gems. So I'll give a shout out, for example, to the Rosie the Riveter National Park in Richmond, California, which is right on the water. I mean, you have a gorgeous view of Alcatraz and the Golden Gate Bridge and the Bay Bridge from over there. And then there's this whole story that, is sort of forgotten, I would argue, in the Bay Area. There's not a huge military production complex any longer, the way there was around World War II, where it grew enormously from so many people, especially women, finding jobs in these shipyards there. So that's a museum that's, really high quality, that's got a lot of great information, and also has been working to recover oral histories and do active programming. But it's sort of a little hidden gem. So I like museums that are, sort of your big flagship experience, but I also love encountering these small little institutions as well.
That's a good point. It seems like the real treasures are on the ends of the bell curve, where there are either massive installations like a Guggenheim or a field museum or, Smithsonian Air and Space, or they're individual passion projects by, just one person. In Independence, Missouri, a woman has put together a museum of hair dolls, which sounds very strange, but this is a lot of dolls were made of this material 100 years ago, so they weren't strange back then. Or one of my favorites is in Kansas City. There's the 1950s all-electric house. The public utility put together this quote-unquote house of the future in the 1950s. So it's total cornball, atomic age. Imagine a house where with the press of a button, your electric curtains will pull back on these ridiculous Rube Goldberg gizmos all over the place. It's just fantastic for a speculative 1950s future, like you would imagine seeing a projector reel that 3M put out of what they think the future will be that they're building. So yeah, it's all these quirky little passion projects that you see that are sometimes the true gems.
I know we'll talk about the future of museums in a second, but something I'm often asked about is, will Instagram, will TikTok forever ruin museums or drive people? Is our Netflix stream just too compelling these days to get us off the couch and go to a museum? And part of me feels like a little bit of the opposite is true. When I've talked to curators about the 1990s, one amusingly told me that they were in a meeting at a major museum in California. And when the first CD-ROM was shown, there was like a panic that people were like, well, no one's going to want to come to the museum because they'll be able to see a picture of the art on their computer. Well, of course, the opposite effect is true, right? Like if you find out that if you're interested in airplanes and you find out that this really amazing airplane collection is at the New England Air Museum, hopefully you're more likely to go visit that institution and pay your hard-earned dollars to go check it out and buy a membership and bring people. So yeah, I sort of think that people are really compelled by experiences, and that the sort of experiential factor of museums should be something that's played up by these institutions in terms of thinking what their valuable assets are. These great people that are passionate that work for these places, these amazing buildings, and then also the great collections that they have.
Well, with that in mind, what we alluded to earlier, what do you see as the future of museums? This is a question, not just what the buildings will be like, and we'll have holographic displays instead of LED monitors all over the place, but the way that our society tries to understand its past in different ways, what do you see as some different scenarios?
Yeah, this is a great question, but also, of course, an impossible one. And then, I know this is a little bit of a cliche joke, but man, you never ask a historian what they think about the future, because we are just notoriously bad at predicting what is coming around the bend in some ways. But I, on the other hand, I also think that by studying the history of museums in crisis, one of the things that we can come to a better understanding of is that we need to broaden our vision. So, for example, if you go back to the year 2001 and read about museums, or 2002, there's a lot of conversation about terrorism in museums. And of course, there were some really tragic episodes of terroristic violence at museums, especially abroad. But it is probably the case that the 2008 financial crisis had a much larger impact on museums overall in that decade. So, and then Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Katrina, there were just other sorts of crises that were around the bend. But we can, I think, make museums more resilient by thinking about how these past crises moments have played out. And let me give you just one example. And that, again, is these hurricanes. Something that's become clear again and again is that it's not just curators and conservators who are sort of, like the fire department running in to save the collections. It's also your custodial staff and your landscape coordinators who are doing things like digging trenches and bringing in, goats to help prevent fire from reaching the Getty. So how do we support people like that? Can we make sure that power sources are available so people can charge their phone in a crisis where power is lost? How do we really care for the staffers? Can we provide workshops that are in disaster response and object handling? so that they are qualified and more empowered to deal with these crisis situations when they emerge in real time. So I think that there are some, and that's not like this utopian sort of description. I think that that's something very really that the Mellon Foundation could take on in sort of an expansion of the programs that they're offering to make museums more resilient in the future.
Well, this is a good reminder that how we understand our past says a lot about our present, but how we'll understand ourselves in the future. There are a lot of topics we couldn't get to in this episode, but for listeners who want to explore this much more, you can check out Samuel's book, which is called The Museum, A Short History of Crisis and Resilience. Samuel, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, that is all for today. If you'd like to see show notes for this episode and all my other episodes, go to parthenonpodcast.com. That's the name of the podcast network that this show is a part of, along with other great history shows like Steve Guerra's Beyond the Big Screen and History of the Papacy, James Early's Key Battles of American History, and other shows as well. If you'd like to support this show, there are two easy ways to do so. The first is to subscribe to History Unplugged on the podcast player of your choice and leave a review. The second thing is to join the show's membership program. It's on Patreon, and if you go to patreon.com/unplugged and join it, as a member, you'll get completely ad-free episodes of the show's entire back catalog, which is 600 episodes and growing.